Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of STEMcast. Today, we are going to be conversing with David Lomelin, who's a freshman at the very prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology, more commonly known as MIT. So, without further ado, let's dive straight into our interview.
I'm Punya Taluka, the co-host.
I'm Sia Gupta, another co host.
So I'm David. I'm a freshman at MIT. Here studying artificial intelligence and decision making. I guess I'll talk about my journey on how I got here and how sort of my daily life is over here. So yeah.
All right, David. So let's start with your journey to MIT. Like, what inspired you to apply to it?
Yeah, so originally I want to say for 90% of my life, like MIT was like not even an option. It was like way above. It was like one of those schools like Harvard or Stanford that like you hear about and like you can't even imagine like getting into these schools. But the first time I really like seriously considered applying to MIT was when I got into MITES. I can talk about that more a little bit, maybe down the podcast. But that was the first moment where I was like, oh, maybe I do have a chance at getting into MIT. But generally, like the main reason why I applied is just because everyone I've talked to like before applying, I talked to a lot of professors and a lot of like students who were at MIT, and they were all like amazing. And even people outside of MIT, I would talk to people at like Harvard or schools like around the Boston area, and everyone was saying like they would keep telling me that like MIT is the school to go to if you want to be really really technical, or maybe build a startup or like do any of these things that I was really interested in. So that was sort of like the main reason why I applied to MIT.
Damn interesting. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
like, while you applied, were there like any challenges, like obstacles that you faced during the entire procedure?
Yeah. So applying to MIT is a little bit of a pain because it doesn't use the Common App, so you have to like redo everything, and you have to do like completely new essays for everything. I think it was what 6 maybe essays that you had to like redo from scratch. So that was kind of a little bit of a pain. Overall, it wasn't that hard. Probably the biggest challenge I had was very last minute. I decided to change sort of like my college narrative because originally I was going to apply as a very like technical person. I did some research papers, which I'll probably talk about in a little bit. And originally that was going to be a very big part of my application. Um, but very last minute, I decided to go to apply as a much more business minded person because I also made some like business and startups that were pretty successful. So that was like a very last minute change to my application. And in the end, I didn't even put my research on my MIT application. So that was probably like a very last minute change when I was applying to MIT.
So, to overcome these challenges that you faced, would you have any tips for high schoolers like us who aspire to apply to MIT?
Yeah. So again, the main issue was just like figuring out like my college narrative. When you're applying to like colleges, you want to like build up like your like character, your person using your extracurriculars. You want to build up a theme. You don't want to just do a bunch of like random extracurriculars, and like not really have it be like part of your application. Like you want everything to like sort of go under one big umbrella. So my advice would be to really just focus on 2 or 3 really strong extracurriculars, and make sure that it all fits like under your theme and like who you're building up your
So,
person
what
and
were
your
those strongest
yeah.
extracurriculars for you personally?
Yeah. So initially, one of my stronger ones was my research that I did. I did some research in computer vision and comparing convolutional neural networks to recurrent neural networks. This was a little bit before like the AI, like the ChatGPT boom and everything. And I want to say I had the research fully done maybe 6 months before it got published. But eventually it got published in IEEE, which was a fun experience. I had to like stay up and like present to people. It was pretty fun. But the main extracurriculars that I ended up applying to MIT with were a startup I did with my friend Dylan Knott called Navarro, and a separate startup called Scholar AI. And they were both sort of different startups that did different things. But basically, the main mission of both were to help students in some way or another to like learn to use AI, maybe to like study better or to learn how to code. And those were sort of the 2 biggest, I want to say like pieces of my application that really like let me get through. And of course, mites was sort of the one of the big things that actually let me stand out in my application, because mites is
Yeah.
not an extracurricular that most people have. And if you're able to have something like mites, or I don't know, any sort of like MIT program on your application, I mean, it's going to really make you stand out. And it's going to tell like the admissions officers like, hey, this student got into mites or any of these other programs. Let's take a closer look at him or her. So yeah, I think those are the three main extracurriculars
Yeah,
that
thank
really
you.
got me into MIT.
So, as high schoolers, we're really fascinated with how life is like at MIT. So, could you describe a typical day there?
Yeah, yeah. So it really depends. You can really do like you can pursue sort of any like life you want to have, right? So I know some friends who all they do is just like study all day and like I mean that's probably gonna be 90% of students here, where there's a very big like work hard culture around everyone. It's a really fun culture. Everyone you talk to is always working on some project or like studying all the time or just doing some sort of project, and that's always fun to see. Um, but for me, I'm really trying to prioritize having a social life because I don't really want to just have like academics be my entire life. Of course, I'm still working. I want to say maybe, depending on the day, maybe like 7 to 8 hours a day minimum just on schoolwork or studying. But I also want to work on my YouTube channel. I have some other projects I'm working on with my friends, which is pretty fun. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's just fun to like go out with your friends and like we just walk around campus. We'll go like sneak into the different buildings and see what we can, explore as much as we can. But yeah, I mean, it really varies. There's no like one like set like day to day schedule that everyone has. But I want to say the biggest like common factor is that everyone works very very hard, no matter sort of what you're pursuing
Yeah,
at
makes
MIT.
sense. What's the coolest project that you've worked on or are currently working on at MIT?
Yeah, so just very recently, I want to say like a week ago, I got into a really really cool research project with I want to say three postdocs, and I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to tell about this research project, but basically we're finding out a way to use like the newly released GPT 4.0 model to like automatically label certain images, where a lot of like big startups like Scale AI have like had billion-dollar valuations because they've been able to like use like humans to label everything very efficiently. But GPT is at a point now where it can be very comparable to humans when it comes to labeling data, and that's sort of the research I'm working on right now. And it's very cool to see just how much GPT and all these chatbots and multimodal like models are just changing everything so quickly. So that's
That
sort of the
is
research
very
I'm
cool.
working on right
Thank you
now.
for telling us about that. So we know that there's a pretty dramatic like shift from high school to college. So what do you think was the biggest difference that you felt when you went to college, from high school as compared to high school?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, there's the aspect that like you're moving away from your home, your friends, your family, and you're sort of like living for your like with yourself for the first time. So that aspect hasn't hit me so hard yet. I'm sure it will in maybe like a month or two. Um, but you really start to like understand like the feeling of like freedom, and you're just gonna have like exponentially more free time than you did when you were at high school, because high school you're stuck in school what maybe like 7 or 8 hours a day, maybe more. And then now once you get to college, I mean, you're maybe going to three, maybe four classes a day at most. So you're getting a lot more free time, and you really have to start like understanding that sense of responsibility where you have to prioritize studying, but at the same time you can't let things like sleep or making friends or maybe like doing exercise like go to waste. You have to be very responsible with your time, and that's really easier said than done. So it's just having the main difference I would say is just you really need to be very very responsible, or else things are just going to fall behind very quickly.
Huh, that's damn interesting. Like about how you manage your this thing, high school and social life at the same time. So let's talk about
Yeah.
AI now. Like before GPT was released, AI wasn't like such a big field. So what was that
Yeah.
initial spark of interest that led you to explore this field?
Yeah, so actually, it's funny you mentioned that because one of the big things that really interested me in AI at first was I think it was maybe the GPT-2 model, where there was some video online that went pretty viral of like one of the first GPT models like showing like signs of intelligence, and that just like really sparked a lot of interest in me. Again, this was way back when like people like didn't know what an LLM was or how like powerful ChatGPT would eventually become. But after I saw that video, I was like, wow, there's like a lot of like power here, and like if we're at this stage now, like what could we be in like 10 years from now, right? And I just found it pretty interesting. And of course, there are things like Tesla Autopilot and all these new technologies that are like really coming out that were really new at the time, and they were just coming out. So it was just sort of that initial interest that really got me sort of like curious about the world of AI. And then I started to learn to code a little bit, and then I took some more like technical AI classes. And then I realized that behind all these like complex actions that like AI models might take, at the very very like base of these models are just very simple. Like it's just linear. It's just like linear equations that are like doing all the work. It's just very very simple math when it comes down to it, and I find it really really interesting that a set of very simple equations can have such complicated outputs and such interesting outputs. Yeah, so that was my sort of like my initial interest in AI and why I've still found AI to be so interesting.
Yeah, so like when you initially learned AI before the release of ChatGPT, I think there weren't many like good like how do I put it tutorials in the sense of how to like go
Mhm.
about with AI as they are now. Like what were like some tough assignments or challenges that you could overcome, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is like before ChatGPT, so like you can like just ChatGPT like an AI model and like know how it worked. So I took a lot of like AI courses before I really like dived like into anything. A lot of like I took mostly Andrew New courses if you're familiar with him at all. But he's a very like yeah. He's a very like prominent person in like the AI world. But a lot of his courses sort of revolve around like just very like more complicated like calculus that I wasn't familiar with at the time. So sort of learning the math behind the AI models was a pretty big challenge for me. That's sort of like the first big challenge. And then after that, just sort of making my first models and like just testing different things out, and trying to get into that whole world of research. Again, that was pretty challenging where I was just reading so many research papers, trying to better understand like how I could like even make an impact in this like field. So I think when you first dive into the world of like AI or any research for that matter, it just seems like such a vast field that it's like impossible to like choose any one research project. But when you really start to focus in on just one really specific like I want to say like section of that field, then you can start to see like places where you can maybe improve or like experiment or do something different. So that's probably like the biggest challenge overall, just like learning the calculus and then actually finding a place to actually do some research in.
Thank you so much for that. Now, diverting a bit from your college life, we want to talk to you about your high school life. What advice would you give to your high school self?
Okay, that's a good question. I think the number one piece of advice I would give to myself and I guess to you guys as well is that I would not do any like extracurriculars just for the sake of colleges. Because at the end of the day, if you're doing something just to say like, "Hey, I did this extracurricular," um, like if there's no passion behind the things that you do, then colleges are going to be like able to see that and they're going to be like, "Oh, he like obviously just did this for college." And like if you aren't able to get into your dream college or like your top college or whatever, if you do something you were really passionate about, all that time and effort you put into building a project or learning some field or doing whatever, it's not going to be a waste, right? Because you've actually like pursued something you're really passionate about and spent time doing something that you love. And then a lot of that times that passion can actually make whatever you're working on a lot better because you're so passionate and excited to work on it every single day that if you're just doing something just for colleges, you're not going to feel that same sort of passion and like ambition that you want. So that's probably the number one piece of advice. Just never do anything just for college applications, but do things because you really, really like to
Yeah,
do
and I think a lot of
that
people
certain
around
thing.
us are doing that. Like they want to fill out their 10 ECs, and that's what people are going after. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's really good advice. What's one tip to stay motivated during exam season or like application season or so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's definitely like a hard. It's definitely one of the harder like times in anyone's lives where you're just like cramming for all these exams. The thing that helped me out the most was prioritizing my sleep and my exercise, because when you're so like used to cramming all the time that you sort of like put these things aside. But at least for me, I found that whenever I would take a moment to like even take a walk or do exercise and like make sure that I would get at least 8 hours of sleep every night, my studying would just be that much more effective. And like I'd be excited to study, right? Instead of like being like all sad and depressed that like, oh, I need to study for this test. I would be like I'd be just like I would feel very like energized and motivated to, make sure that I could study every day. But for me, those were the two biggest factors to stay motivated. Just sleep a lot and exercise, and I think the rest of it just comes with those two sort of things.
Yeah, I think that's especially a big problem in our grade specifically because a lot of people I
Yeah,
see they're like saying 6 or maybe 5 hours of sleep, working all night. So what I feel like, let's diverting from this a bit. Let's move on to like something fun and personal. Like what is like MIT is regarded as a very rigorous university. So what are some like fun things that you didn't expect would be there?
yeah. So, okay, that's a good question. So I think one of the things I didn't really expect coming into here was that even though people are like very, very serious and like very passionate about their work, they still have time to like pursue their own hobbies or like just do things for fun. So I'll give you a couple of examples. A lot of my friends, even though they got into MIT for their gifts like in math or science or whatever, they still take the time to like play the guitar or piano, or maybe like DJ or like draw or like do a bunch of random hobbies that you wouldn't really expect these like super prestigious kids to be doing. But that's like been a very common theme where even though they're like some of the smartest people in the world, they still have time for themselves and like just to do things that they really love to do. And there's sort of been a culture where, again, it's like work hard, but at the same time, a lot of these students like to play hard. And whether that be like, partying or just like exploring the campus or, doing hacks or just doing whatever. A lot of students here like make sure that they have time for themselves. And that's something that I really wasn't expecting. I was expecting there to be a lot more of a culture of just like working hard all the time, but the large majority of people here still do have a lot of time for themselves to do things that they just like to do, even though they might not be like the best at that thing or they're just doing it for fun. I've found sort of that trend with the large majority of people I've met here.
Huh. That's a very unexpected thing to hear, honestly.
Yeah.
So like now, if you could like redo your entire high school journey, then what is the one thing that you could do like differently?
Hmm. I think that's a good question. I think the one thing I would do differently is in senior year, I sort of like after college applications and like all my grades like stopped mattering. I sort of like stopped caring so much. And I wish I cared a little bit more during senior year. It's very easy to get in the mindset of like, oh, it's senior year, my grades don't matter anymore. Like I could just be lazy and do whatever. But that's just a full year where you can just pursue the things that you love, right? And that's like a very rare opportunity that you're not going to get again in like the rest of your life, probably, where you're going to be going to college and then working right after. And you're never going to have a year where you're going to have virtually, you're going to have a lot less work. You're going to have a lot less pressure to do well on your extracurriculars or your exams. And I wish that I took that year and maybe pursued startups a little bit harder, or maybe did a little bit more research, or just did hobbies that I really like to do. And that's probably the one regret that I know a lot of like high schoolers will probably have at the end of their 4 years, where they worked extremely hard their freshman, sophomore, junior year, but by the time they get to their senior year, they're just burnt out and they don't do anything. So I would just say take that last year and do something that you love. Even if it fails, who cares? You spent a year doing something that you really enjoy. So that's probably my one big regret
That
during
is
high school.
great, great advice. Thank you so much for that. Let's talk more about your future goals. So, what are your plans after MIT?
Yeah, so I mean that's a pretty loaded question. Um, so one of the options I have sort of floating in the air right now is that MIT has a +1 master's program where if you're above a certain GPA and you're doing really well in your classes, you can do a master's in 1 year. So that's one possibility. But in terms of career, something that I've been pursuing, I've talked about this a little bit already. It's just startups. I really really love startups and making new businesses and growing businesses and just trying to innovate in some way or another. It is a little bit more difficult because as an undergraduate, I'm not like pushing like the limits of innovation right now, and my strengths sort of just come in like software development and doing things like SaaS businesses. Um, but I think right now I'm starting to build a lot of connections sort of in the startup realm, and hopefully maybe sometime this year, maybe sometime next year, I can start to work on a startup and like hopefully get something going. That's obviously the dream. That's the dream is to come out of MIT working full time on a startup. Um, but if that doesn't happen for whatever reason, I might spend another year in school, and then from there I'll sort of
Who
see
has
what
been
I want to
your
do.
biggest inspiration or role model all your life?
Okay, that's a good question. I think I haven't had one big role model for like anything ever. I think basing your entire future off just like one like person like often can be like a big mistake because these people are like everyone is flawed. There's always going to be mistakes. But I think it's a lot more wise to look at individual traits that people have and sort of pursue that. So again, going back to the Andrew New example, right? He's a very hardworking person. He's extremely technical, and of course, that's something I look up to. And then I had a lot of classmates that one of the things that I always looked up to in them was that again they were really hardworking, and there were certain things that I looked up to them in life. Um, there's never gonna be one person that's like gonna be perfect for like a perfect role model for you, but I think it's a lot more wise to again just look at certain people with certain like aspects that they might have and like try to pursue that. But I would never like try to be exactly like anyone else. You sort of have to like do your own thing. If you're just copying someone else, you're not doing anything new in the world. And I mean, at the end of the day, like you don't want to be an exact copy of someone
That was
else.
deep. Thank you. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay, so now we want to ask you some of the questions that our audience asked us. We have some student questions here. So,
yeah.
one person asks, what steps did you take in grades 9 and 10 to build your application?
Yeah. So honest, I'm gonna be very honest. Ninth grade, I was not. School was not a top priority. It was the COVID year for me, and like it was just online, and yeah, it was just sort of one of those years where I wasn't doing a whole lot. I was just sort of like trying to do my best to get A's in my classes, and that was pretty much it. But in 10th grade, I spent the majority of the year really trying to understand like all the technicals behind computer science. I took Harvard CS50, and then I took Harvard CS50 like AI course after that, and then all the Andrew New courses I mentioned beforehand. So I spent like all of 10th grade just learning, right? I had maybe like two projects. I did one project that was like my very first startup ever. It was called Super Soul, and like honestly, it was just like complete failure, but that's okay because I learned a lot. And then another project that I started very late in 10th grade, like during summer in 10th grade after like I had learned everything with coding. I did a very simple research project. In the end, it got published in some student journal, and it was pretty cool, but it wasn't something that would eventually become one of my like top like three C's or whatever. So I think in those like early ninth to 10th grade years, you really want to just try out different things, see what you like, and then once you understand what you like, then put all of your energy into just learning as much as you possibly can, and then maybe doing some projects on the side while you learn. So yeah, like ninth and 10th grade, I didn't do anything phenomenal. I just tried different things out, learned as much as I could, and I sort of set up a base for my 11th grade year, where I actually took a lot of these skills and just built a lot of projects, and actually, develop these extracurriculars that I would eventually put on my college application. But again, there's nothing wrong with like starting projects in like 10th grade. If you have the skills, that's great. But personally, I just took most of that year to just sort of learn
So, one
everything that
question that
I
I
wanted to learn.
personally would like to ask you is that how important is research for colleges like MIT? Because you told us that you didn't end up submitting your research paper. So, why is that? What went behind that?
Yeah. So if I'm being honest, I probably should have put my research on my application. But there were other extracurriculars that, again, I thought they fit my sort of like narrative a little bit better. I can't speak too much for the admissions officers. It really depends on what type of person you're trying to build like during your application. If you're trying to build like a very technical person who is very much in the field, then of course include your research. And like research can play a very big part of that. Um, but generally, research isn't that impactful unless you've worked with a faculty or you've published it in a pretty like prestigious journal. And a lot of the times that can be very, very difficult, and it can take a long time. Like I said, it took my research almost 6 months to get published, which is like a pretty big amount of time. So research is not always the best option, but it can be a very big like boost in your college application. So I can't answer this question generally for everyone. It just depends sort of what you're trying to like do in your college application and who you're trying to apply as.
Yeah, so like I have a friend who's like very skilled at the field of mathematics specifically, and I was talking to him the
Yeah.
other day about the intersection of machine learning and AI, machine learning and
Yeah.
maths. My bad. So he was especially interested, like the he read a research paper and he found the maths behind it to be like a bit too complex. So how would you
Mm.
suggest someone to approach machine learning with a maths perspective and like use it to push the boundaries by like creating more efficient models?
Yeah. So I knew sort of the basics of like the math behind AI, but the reality is that there's so many really, really strong packages built now. So for example, like PyTorch, it really simplifies a lot of the math, and you don't have to do a lot of like the manual like computing yourself. So if you're okay with not knowing the math behind like an AI model, then you can just sort of like you can just go to PyTorch, create a model in like 5 minutes, and have something that works. But I do think that it is important, at least to an extent, to sort of understand the maths behind machine learning, so you actually understand what you're doing, and you can better understand like the technical processes behind machine learning instead of just making it sort of like a black box where you don't know exactly what's going on. So if you're letting sort of like all the theoreticals in math stop you from like pursuing machine learning, then maybe you might be looking at it a little bit too closely, and like it's okay to like skim over some things. But generally, I would advise towards getting like a full as much as an understanding as you can behind the math behind machine learning.
Okay, one student asks, could you outline some of your scores throughout high school, like, for example, your SAT or ACT score and your high school GPA, all of that?
Yeah, yeah. So honestly, my GPA and SAT scores were not a strong part of my application. I think I had all A's during my high school years, and that I ended up with a 4.5 or a 4.6 GPA. And for comparison, I think that was maybe top 10% or top 15% in my school. So I wasn't like the top of my school, but I was like definitely up there. And then for my SAT, I believe I got a 1530 SAT, which is a little bit below average at MIT. But I think the majority of people I've talked to here have had between a 1560 to a 1580. I am a little bit of an underlier where my GPA and my SAT scores might not like stack up against the rest of like the people here at MIT. But like it definitely is doable if you have like slightly lower test scores and GPA than I did. You just have to make sure that you have some sort of like in with MIT, whether that be through like mites or RSI or like some sort of like unique thing that can actually get you past the admissions officers and make sure that they actually look at your application.
Yeah, so regarding on that process, like what will like differentiate MIT alumni from like Stanford alumni?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So from what I've understood, well, okay, I'm going to take this from the perspective of startups because that's sort of Stanford's main focus. Um, so Stanford again has like a huge startup culture, right? They're one of the biggest startup cultures where everyone is building something, and that's great, right? Like they have
Yeah.
one of the best startup cultures in the world, and they're all doing everything. And of course, I'm a little biased, but I think MIT is better because from what I've understood and from everyone I've talked to, is that people at MIT are a lot more willing to collaborate and share their ideas with startups and be just a lot more open in helping if you have sort of any startup idea. So even though everyone at MIT is not building a startup, those who are building a startup tend to be a little bit more like collaborative and helping and just more open than things that I've heard from students at Stanford. So it just sort of depends what you're looking for, especially if you're just sort of like in the startup world. From a more academic perspective, I'm not so sure. I haven't really talked to too many Stanford people about that. But at least from the startup side, I do think that Stanford has a much bigger community around startups and has, I would say, maybe slightly better resources than MIT. But I would say that the people at MIT are definitely a lot more open and a lot more helpful. And because there's less people in startups at MIT, the resources at MIT are a lot more like open and accessible for you to use. So it just sort of depends what you're looking for there. But both schools, yeah, but both schools are absolutely phenomenal, and yeah, I mean, there's you
So,
can't go
what's
wrong. You
one
just can't go wrong.
misconception that people have about MIT that you recently discovered?
Okay, that's a good question. Um, I would say that MIT has a very big notion of being like everyone here is like a nerd and like all they do is study. Again, I'll say that's true to an extent. But we do have a pretty big like Greek life culture here, where 50% of boys are actually in a fraternity, which is like very very high. Like one in two people you talk to are going to be in a fraternity, and not everything at MIT is just like academically focused. Like there are a lot of like really cool social events and like social communities that are always going around. And a lot of like the dorm cultures are actually like very open and like inviting and social. Again, it sort of depends what dorm you decide to live in. Some dorms are a lot more focused on academics, and you might never like see anyone outside. But the dorm I live in specifically, which is Baker Dorm, has a very big culture of being a little bit more social, and a little bit more talkative. So you'll definitely find those sort of like stereotypical like people who just work all day and like just stay inside in their room all day and just study. But there, on the flip side, there's definitely a lot of people who are part of a fraternity, have a more social life, again have time for themselves and do things. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception that I've heard about MIT.
Huh. So like students here are like what? So if you could like highlight one thing, not for colleges, but like what you've personally learned, one thing that you would like love to redo again from scratch,
Hmm.
what would it be?
That I could redo again.
Yeah, like have that experience again.
Hmm. I think I don't know. Like a lot of like the first moments of like when um like high school graduation or like walking onto campus for the first time or like sleeping alone for the first time. Those are all really great experiences. But I think probably the thing I would want to live again. Hmm. I think it would just be one of my favorite like memories in high school was my robotics club, where even though it wasn't a huge part of my application, like my robotics club didn't get me into MIT, but it was a sort of big part of my routine where I would spend a couple hours every day just working on the robot and talking to my like those were my best friends working on the robot together, and we would just have like the funniest conversations. Um, it sort of goes back to my point where you need to do things because you love them, not because you want to do it for a college application. And I knew that the robotics team would never be a big part of like my college application, and that it probably wouldn't get me into like a top school alone. But I just love being in that community so much, talking to my friends, building the robot, that honestly it just didn't matter. So that's probably the number one thing that I miss, just doing things absolutely for fun, knowing full well that they might not contribute that much to my college application, but just doing things for fun. That's the number one thing that I would say I wish I could live again. Yeah, like you have to do projects because you're truly passionate for them, not just for college or for any other reason.
So, how important do you think are leadership positions for getting into colleges like MIT? Like, maybe being the student body president or just being part of the council. How important is that?
Yeah, so it definitely okay. That's a pretty loaded question. I actually talked about this a little bit on my latest YouTube video. I don't know if you got a chance to see that. But it really depends what club you're in and sort of what you're doing within that club that actually matters. Um, so the real okay, say you're okay. I'll give an example. So I started the computer science club at my school, and I thought I was like that alone would get me into like one of the top schools because like I took the initiative to make my own club and like organize all these meetings and do all these cool things. But the reality is that there's so many people with sort of that officer position that anyone could just say like, oh, I was sort of like made this club. And schools like MIT or Harvard or Stanford or whatever, they're getting tens of thousands of applications of people saying that they were like a top officer at their school or at their club or whatever. And you need to be able to say that while I was a president, I wasn't just a president, but I also made X amount of impact, or Y amount of people joined while I was president, or maybe we raised this much money for this cause, or we did these cool projects. You just need to do something beyond just being president for it to actually matter on your college application. Because anyone can just say I was president of a club, but not that many people can say that I took this club and did something really special with it. So I think, yeah, you can't just say like you had a title. You have to actually take the next step and actually do something with that title.
All right. So I think that is it.
Thank you so much for conversing with us. It was
Thank you.
really nice
Great,
speaking to
perfect.
you, and all the advice that you gave us